The old man looked like he had already lost everything except the courage to ask one last stranger for help. He stood in the rain outside a bus shelter on the south side of Milwaukee, holding a soaked scrap of paper in one hand and staring at my phone like it was the only door left open in the world. Then he said, "Please, I need to call my daughter, because if I wait until morning, I may never get another chance. My name is Lena Carter." And at that point in my life, I had $12.43 in my checking account, a pair of shoes held together with black electrical tape, and exactly 0 reasons to trust a strange man after 11 at night. I had just worked 16 hours, first cleaning patient rooms at St. Matthew Medical Center, then serving meatloaf and burnt coffee at a little place called Rosie's Grill, where a family of 6 had stayed 20 minutes past closing and left me 3/4 under a napkin like they were doing charitable work. All I wanted was the number 18 bus, a hot shower, and maybe 4 hours of sleep before I had to do it again. The man was standing just outside the shelter, getting drenched, like he did not believe he belonged under the roof with me. He was probably in his early 70s, tall but folded in on himself, with silver hair stuck to his forehead and an old green army jacket torn at one shoulder. His hands were shaking so badly the wet paper rattled between his fingers. I should have looked away. My mother had raised me to be kind, but she had also raised me in a neighborhood where kindness without caution could get you robbed, hurt, or worse. So I asked him who he needed to call. He looked down at the number and said, "My daughter Claire. I have not heard her voice in 6 years." His words came out slowly, each one dragging something heavy behind it. I asked why tonight mattered, and he gave me a tired little smile that was not really a smile at all. "Doctor told me this afternoon that the cancer is in my liver and my bones. They said months, maybe less. I have been carrying her number in my wallet for 2 years, and I kept telling myself I would call when I knew what to say. Turns out there is no right thing to say after 6 years. There is only now or never. I do not know what happened inside me at that moment. Maybe it was the way he said never. Maybe it was because I had spent the previous year watching my own father disappear into dementia, one memory at a time, until every conversation felt like a door quietly closing. Or maybe I was simply too tired to be afraid. I pulled out my phone, the cheap one with the cracked screen and a picture of my 11-year-old daughter, Maya, tucked inside the clear case, and I held it toward him. "Make the call," I said. He took it with both hands. His thumb kept missing the numbers, so I finally read them from the paper and dialed for him. The line rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, a woman answered with the careful voice people use when they do not recognize a number. "Hello." The old man opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He pressed his fist to his lips, closed his eyes, and tried again. "Claire?" he whispered. "It is Dad." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to hear rain tapping against the plastic roof above us. Then the woman said, "You have some nerve calling me." He flinched like she had slapped him, but he did not hang up. "I know," he said. "I know I do. I am not calling to defend myself. I am calling because I was wrong. And I may not have much time left to say it." Her voice sharpened. "You had 6 years. You had 6 years to say anything. You missed my wedding. You never met your grandson. You sent back every letter." The old man turned away from me, but the shelter was small, and grief takes up more space than people realize. I heard him say that after his wife died, he blamed Claire for moving away and taking a job in Seattle. He had convinced himself that if she had stayed, her mother might have fought harder, lived longer, somehow beaten a disease that had never cared where Claire lived. At the funeral, he had said unforgivable things in front of the entire family. Then pride had done what grief started, turning weeks into months and months into years. "Claire," he said, "I punished you because I did not know what to do with the pain. That was not love. It was cowardice. I am sorry." The woman on the other end began crying. Not loudly, just the kind of crying that makes breathing difficult. She asked where he was. He told her the intersection. She said, "Do not move. I am calling my brother in Wauwatosa. He is 20 minutes away. You are going with him to the hospital, and tomorrow I am getting on the first flight home." The old man pressed the phone against his forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. Then he said, "I love you, kiddo." Claire answered after a long pause. "I love you too, Dad, but I am still angry." He gave a broken little laugh. "Fair enough." When the call ended, he handed the phone back and looked at me with eyes so red they barely seemed human. "You just gave me back my family," he said. I shook my head and told him all I had done was lend him a phone. He said, "Sometimes that is the same thing." Then headlights appeared at the far end of the block, and a Dart pickup pulled toward the curb. The old man stepped into the rain, turned once, and asked my name. I told him Lena. He repeated it carefully, like he was placing it somewhere safe, then climbed into the truck and disappeared. By the time my bus arrived, I had already convinced myself I would never see him again. I had bigger problems. My daughter needed new glasses. My father's home care bill was overdue. And the landlord at our apartment building had just posted a notice announcing major renovations and possible lease adjustments. That phrase, possible lease adjustments, turned out to mean a 65% rent increase and 30 days to accept it. 3 mornings after the bus stop, a silver Bentley rolled into the cracked parking lot of Harborview Apartments, followed by 2 black SUVs. A man named Grant Wexler stepped out wearing a camel-colored coat, polished shoes, and the expression of someone entering a building he had already decided was beneath him. He had recently purchased a property through a company called Wexler Urban Partners, and he gathered every tenant in the laundry room because the community space had been closed for mold repairs that never happened. He stood beside a glossy rendering of a luxury development called Lakefront Row and told us our building was an underperforming asset in a rapidly appreciating corridor. What he meant was that poor people were living on land rich people wanted. Mrs. Delgado from 3C asked where elderly tenants were supposed to go. Grant smiled at her without warmth and said, "Housing decisions are personal responsibilities, ma'am, not corporate obligations." I felt my hand tighten around the strap of my work bag. Then he looked directly at me, glanced at my hospital uniform, and said, "I understand change can feel frightening to people without financial flexibility, but progress cannot be held hostage by sentiment." I asked whether shutting off heat in November counted as progress, because ours had been failing for 2 weeks. His smile disappeared. "You should be careful about making accusations in a public meeting, Miss Carter." I told him he should be careful about giving the reasons to make them. The room went silent. Grant stepped closer until only a folding table stood between us. "You clean rooms for a living, correct?" I said yes. He nodded toward the tenants behind me and said, "Then I suggest you focus on cleaning instead of pretending you understand real estate law." A few of his people laughed. Grant gathered his papers, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked out, leaving 32 families staring at one another like passengers who had just learned the ship was sinking. That was the moment I understood he was not expecting resistance. He was counting on exhaustion. He believed people who worked 2 jobs, cared for sick parents, raised children alone, and stretched every dollar until it nearly tore would never have enough energy left to fight him. The ugly part was, he was almost right. That night, after Maya went to sleep and my father finally stopped pacing the hallway, I sat at the kitchen table with the red notice in front of me and my cracked phone beside it. I thought about the old man in the rain, carrying a phone number for 2 years because fear had convinced him tomorrow was guaranteed. Then I looked at the eviction timeline, picked up my phone, and started calling every tenant in the building, because I did not know how to beat Grant Wexler. But I knew exactly what would happen if we stayed silent. By midnight, I had spoken to 26 tenants and left messages for the rest. By 1 in the morning, my kitchen table was covered with handwritten notes, names, apartment numbers, broken heaters, leaking pipes, rent receipts, photographs, and enough anger to warm the whole building better than Grant Wexler ever had. The next evening, 30 people crowded into the laundry room between 2 broken dryers and a vending machine that had been stealing quarters since 2019. I stood in front of them wearing my blue hospital uniform because I had come straight from work, and I told them the truth. I did not know housing law. I did not know how property development worked. I did not have money, influence, or time. What I had was a landlord who believed we were too tired to organize, and I had spent most of my adult life being underestimated by men who mistook exhaustion for weakness. Mrs. Hafferston Calatry. Delgado raised her hand and said, "So, what are we actually doing, Lena?" That was a fair question. I looked around the room and said, "First, we document everything, every broken heater, every threat, every notice, every phone call. Do not argue with management alone. Do not sign anything without showing the group. If they enter your apartment, record it. If they shut off water or electricity, call me, call the city, call everybody. Grant wants 32 separate frightened families. We are going to give him one building. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mr. Profin, Boone from 1A, a retired machinist with oxygen tubes in his nose, lifted his cane and said, "About damn time." People laughed, and the tension cracked just enough for us to breathe. We formed committees. Though calling them committees made us sound far more organized than we were. Mrs. Afrais Delgado handled Spanish-speaking tenants. A college student named Jamal built a shared online folder. Mr. Mon Boone kept a handwritten log because he did not trust clouds unless they were in the sky. And I became the person everyone called when something went wrong. Something went wrong almost every day. 2 mornings later, maintenance removed the front door lock from apartment 2D while the tenant was at work, claiming it needed replacement, then failed to install a new one until midnight. The following week, water pressure disappeared on the 4th floor. A city inspector arrived and somehow found violations inside tenant units but missed the exposed wiring in the basement and the boiler that sounded like it was digesting a toolbox. Bright orange notices appeared on doors, warning that personal belongings in hallways created fire hazards. Even when the so-called belongings were strollers and walkers, Grant was not trying to fix Harbor View. He was trying to make living there feel temporary. Then came the buyout offers. His assistant, a thin man named Curtis Bell with perfect hair and a voice like a customer service recording, knocked on doors carrying envelopes. $5,000 if we left within 10 days. $3,000 if we left within 20. Nothing after that. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, $5,000 looked enormous until you tried to find another apartment in Milwaukee with first month's rent, last month's rent, a security deposit, moving costs, and enough left over to keep the lights on. 6 families accepted. I did not blame them. That was part of Grant's cruelty, making survival look like betrayal. The worst night came when Curtis knocked on my door while Maya sat at the kitchen table doing fractions, and my father slept in the next room. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, glanced around at our secondhand furniture, and placed an envelope on the table. $10,000, he said. More than anyone else has been offered. I asked why I was special. Because you are creating unnecessary conflict. He smiled like he was discussing a parking ticket. Mr. Atta, Wexler respects your energy, but this building will be redeveloped. The only question is whether you leave with money or leave with nothing. I pushed the envelope back toward him. He did not take it. Instead, he looked at Maya's school books and then toward my father's room. Your daughter attends Lincoln Prep. Correct. Your father receives home health services through a county-supported program. These systems are complicated. Funding changes. Placements change. People who create public controversy sometimes discover that life becomes more complicated than it needs to be. I felt the room narrow around me. Maya stopped writing. She was watching us without moving. I lowered my voice and said, "Are you threatening my child and my father?" Curtis gave me a wounded look. Of course not. I'm explaining that stability is valuable. I stood, picked up the envelope, opened the door, and dropped it into the hallway. Get out. His smile faded. You are making a mistake. Maybe, I said, but it is mine to make. After he left, I locked the door and checked it twice. Maya asked who he was. I told her he worked for the landlord. She looked at me for a long second and said, "He's scared of you." I almost laughed. Baby, men like that are not scared of people like me. She shook her head. Then why did he come here? I did not have an answer. The truth was, I was scared enough for both of us. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the hallway made me sit up. At 3 in the morning, my father wandered into the kitchen wearing one slipper and asked if my mother was coming home. She had been dead for 9 years. I guided him back to bed, tucked the blanket around his shoulders, and stayed beside him until he fell asleep. Sitting there, in the dark, I wondered whether fighting was selfish. Maybe taking the $10,000 would have been smarter. Maybe my responsibility was not to save the building, but to protect Maya and Dad. People like Grant counted on those doubts. They did not need to defeat you in court if they could make you defeat yourself at 3 in the morning. The next day I received a call from St. Biella's Matthew's billing department saying my father's payment assistance application had been placed under review. That same afternoon, Lincoln Prep emailed me about an unexpected problem with Maya's scholarship renewal documents, 2 unrelated systems, both suddenly uncertain. Within hours of Curtis mentioning them, I stood in a supply closet at the hospital, surrounded by disinfectant bottles and paper towels. and felt something cold settle in my chest. Grant had not merely threatened me, he had started pulling strings. I called Curtis and asked him if he enjoyed frightening children. He said, "I have no idea what you are talking about." Then he added, "You still have 48 hours to accept the offer." I hung up before I said something that could be used against me. That evening, I gathered everyone again. I told them about Curtis, the offer, and the calls concerning my family. Mrs. Delgado covered her mouth. Jamal started swearing. "Mr. Prof." Boone struck his cane against the floor and said we should call the police. But call them about what? A polite man in a suit had made vague comments, and 2 bureaucratic offices had requested extra paperwork. Grant knew exactly how to hurt people without leaving fingerprints. I told the group I was considering stepping back. Saying it out loud felt like swallowing broken glass. I expected disappointment, maybe anger. Instead, Mrs. Kolb Delgado stood, walked across the room, and took my hands. "You do not get to carry all of us alone," she said. "That is not what together means." Then she turned to everyone else and asked who would keep fighting if I needed time. Every hand went up. Even the families who had accepted buyouts sent copies of their notices and emails before leaving. That was the night I stopped thinking of myself as the person saving Harbor View. The building was saving me too. The next morning, a white envelope was waiting at the hospital reception desk with my name typed across the front. Inside was a business card for Naomi Pierce, an attorney with Harlan, Pierce and West, one of the largest law firms in the city. On the back, someone had written, "Call before you sign anything. Legal representation is fully covered." I stared at the card for 10 minutes before dialing. Naomi answered on the second ring. She had a calm voice, low and direct, and she already knew my name, my address, the rent increase, the utility problems, even the buyout offer. I asked who had hired her. She said her client preferred privacy. I told her anonymous generosity made me nervous. She replied, "Good, it should. Blind trust is how people like Grant Wexler make money. Come to my office tomorrow. Bring everything." Her office overlooked Lake Michigan from the 17th floor of a tower so clean, I was afraid my shoes might be charged admission. I wore my best blouse, which still had a faint bleach mark near the cuff, and carried 3 grocery bags filled with documents. The receptionist looked at the bags, then at me, but Naomi came out herself and shook my hand. She was in her late 40s, with short dark hair, silver-framed glasses, and the posture of someone who had never once apologized for entering a room. We spent 4 hours reviewing the evidence. She read every notice, every lease, every inspection report. Around the second hour, she stopped making notes and began smiling, which was not comforting. I asked what was funny. She tapped one of Grant's orange notices. "This man is either arrogant, careless, or both." He cited commercial occupancy regulations to condemn residential units. He used an inspector whose license was suspended last year. He increased rents without providing the notice required under the city's tenant relocation ordinance. He interfered with heat service during cold weather, and if we can connect the scholarship and medical reviews to his office, that becomes retaliation. She leaned back. Grant Wexler is not running a redevelopment project. He is running an illegal displacement campaign with expensive stationery. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear. It was not hope yet. Hope felt too dangerous. It was more like finding solid ground under one foot. Naomi filed an emergency injunction that afternoon. By sunset, Grant was legally prohibited from evicting anyone, shutting off utilities, entering units without proper notice, or pressuring tenants to accept buyouts. The court also ordered the city to conduct an independent inspection. When the papers were served, Grant arrived at Harbor View himself. I was outside helping Mr. Tybe Boone carry groceries when the Bentley stopped at the curb. Grant stepped out, slammed the door, and crossed the sidewalk so fast his driver had to jog behind him. He held a court order in one hand. "You think this changes anything?" he said. I looked at the paper. "Seems like it changes at least 4 things. His face tightened. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." "Neither did you," I said. He moved closer, lowering his voice. "Whoever is paying that lawyer will get bored. Wealthy people always do. They collect causes the way they collect art. And when something shinier appears, they move on. Then you will still be here. And so will I." I wanted to believe he was bluffing, but the words found the exact fear I had been trying not to name. What if the anonymous help disappeared? What if Naomi left? What if I led everyone into a fight we could not finish? Grant saw the doubt and smiled. There it is, he whispered. Reality. Then another car pulled up behind his Bentley. Not flashy, just a dark blue sedan. The rear door opened, and the old man from the bus shelter stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a navy suit and carrying a black cane. He looked thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were clear. Grant turned toward him, and every bit of color left his face. The old man glanced at me, then at Grant, and said, "You always did mistake cruelty for intelligence." Grant stared at him as though the rain had delivered a ghost. "Martin," he said. "Martin Vale." I had heard that name before, though it took me a moment to place it. Vale Industrial Systems, airports, hospitals, power grids. A company worth more money than I could imagine. The old man I had handed my cracked phone to was Martin Vale, the billionaire founder who had vanished from public life 6 years earlier. Martin walked toward us slowly, leaning on the cane, and stopped beside me. He did not look at Grant when he spoke. "Lena, I believe I owe you an explanation." Grant's jaw hardened. "This is none of your concern, Martin." Martin finally turned to him. "You threaten her daughter. You interfere with her father's care. You terrorize 32 families to steal a building you do not even fully own. I would say you made it my concern." Grant laughed, but the sound came out dry. "Arbor View belongs to Wexler Urban Partners." Martin raised one eyebrow. "The structure does. The ground beneath it is held by a 99-year trust established in 1958. And yesterday, my daughter's company acquired the controlling interest in that trust." Grant said nothing. Martin's voice remained quiet. "You own bricks, Grant. We own the land under your shoes." Grant looked down at the pavement as if he could somehow see the trust documents buried beneath it. Then back at Martin, searching for the version of the old man he remembered, the grieving widower who had walked away from boardrooms, lawyers, and every fight that mattered. That man was gone. Or maybe he had simply been waiting at a bus stop in the rain for somebody to remind him he still had a reason to come home. Grant straightened his coat and forced a smile. "You bought a land trust to impress a janitor." Martin rested both hands on the top of his cane. "No. I bought it because you once taught me what happens when decent people leave power in the hands of men like you." Then he turned to me. "Lena, the attorney who contacted you works for my daughter, Claire. The scholarship review at Maya's school has been resolved. Your father's medical assistance is protected, and both offices have opened internal investigations into who requested those reviews." I stared at him, still trying to connect the soaked, trembling stranger from the bus shelter with the man standing beside me now. "You did all this because I let you borrow my phone." Martin shook his head. "You did not lend me a phone. You gave me the chance to apologize before I die with the worst mistake of my life sitting between me and my children." "There is a difference," Grant interrupted with a bitter laugh. "This is sentimental theater. A deep metallic billionaire finds a working-class mascot and decides to play savior." "How touching." Martin's expression did not change, but Naomi stepped out of the sedan behind him carrying a thick folder. "Actually, Mr. Wexler," she said, "what comes next is less sentimental." She handed him a copy of a subpoena. Her investigation had uncovered payments from Wexler Urban Partners to Curtis Bell's private consulting company, followed by matching donations to the re-election fund of the city inspector who had signed our false violations. There were emails instructing staff to create tenant fatigue through strategic service interruptions, a phrase so polished and bloodless it made me sick. There were spreadsheets ranking residents by vulnerability, age, income, disability, number of children, immigration status, likelihood of accepting a buyout. My name appeared at the top of a separate page labeled Organizing Risk. Beside it, someone had written Daughter Scholarship, Dependent Parent, Pressure Points Available. I read those words twice. My family had been reduced to leverage in a business file. Grant glanced at the documents and handed them back as though they were restaurant menus he did not like. "Internal planning language is not a crime." Naomi smiled. "Bribery is. Retaliation is. Fraud is. Interfering with public benefits can be, depending on what the investigators find." Grant looked toward Martin again. "You think you can bury me because you have more money?" Martin said, "I think your own records will do that." The independent inspectors arrived the following morning. This time, they examined the boiler, electrical system, roof, plumbing, and every repair request management had ignored. Their final report said Harborview was structurally sound but had suffered years of deliberate neglect. The city ordered Wexler Urban Partners to restore the heat, repair the elevators, replace damaged wiring, and place 6 months of rent into an escrow account for tenant compensation. Naomi also discovered that Grant's 65% increase violated 3 separate notice requirements and triggered relocation payments he had never intended to provide. The court froze all pending evictions. Grant responded the way powerful men often do when consequences first arrive, by claiming he was the victim. He went on local television in a dark suit and said outside interests were blocking progress, destroying jobs, and manipulating vulnerable residents for political purposes. He called Harborview unsafe in one sentence and accused us of refusing to leave it in the next. He never mentioned the bribed inspector, the pressure point list, or the message Curtis had sent after visiting my apartment that read, "Carter is emotional but movable if we squeeze the kid." That message was the reason I agreed to speak at the public hearing. The council chamber was packed so tightly people stood along the walls. Grant arrived with 5 attorneys, 2 public relations consultants, and a scale model of Lakefront Row displayed beneath a clear plastic cover. The model had glass towers, rooftop gardens, boutique shops, and tiny plastic trees greener than anything that grew in our neighborhood. There were no tiny plastic people who looked like us. Grant spoke first. He described Harborview as blight. He promised tax revenue, luxury retail, and hundreds of construction jobs. He said redevelopment required difficult choices and that emotional attachment could not outweigh the economic future of the city. Then he made the mistake men like him always make. He looked at me in my faded blue hospital uniform and decided humiliation would work better than evidence. With respect, he said, housing policy should not be dictated by someone whose professional experience consists of changing bedsheets and emptying trash. A few people on his side laughed. I could hear Maya inhale behind me. My father sat beside her, confused by the room but holding her hand. For 1 second, I felt the old instinct rise inside me. The instinct to shrink, lower my eyes, and let the important people speak. Then I remembered how many rooms I had cleaned at St. Matthew's. I remembered blood on floors, families sleeping upright beside hospital beds, doctors crying in supply closets, rich men calling nurses by the wrong names, and poor women saying thank you for a cup of water. Cleaning had taught me more about human dignity than Grant Wexler had learned in every boardroom he ever entered. I stepped toward the microphone. You are right about one thing, Mr. Wexler. I empty trash for a living. That means I know the difference between something worthless and something somebody just decided not to see. The chamber went silent. You call Harborview blight because the paint is peeling? But your company refused to paint it. You call our homes unsafe after paying an inspector to invent violations while ignoring the real repairs. You call us obstacles because it sounds better than mothers, children, veterans, nurses, cooks, mechanics, and old people who built their lives there. You are not creating progress. You are creating misery until the land becomes cheap enough for your investors. Grant leaned toward his microphone. That is a rehearsed accusation from a woman being financed by a billionaire with a personal grudge. Martin rose slowly from the front row. He looked frail under the chamber lights, but his voice carried to the back wall. He is correct that I have a personal history with him. 20 years earlier, Grant had worked under Martin at Vale Industrial Systems. Martin trusted him with a redevelopment subsidiary focused on restoring abandoned factories. Instead, Grant had secretly diverted properties into shell companies, inflated construction invoices, and pushed Martin's longtime partner out of the deal. Martin had discovered the fraud shortly after his wife became ill, but rather than fight, he signed a settlement and disappeared. Grant built his real estate empire with money taken from that scheme. I let grief make me absent. Martin told the council, my silence did not make me innocent. It made men like him stronger. He placed the original partnership records on the evidence table, along with bank transfers, forged signatures, and correspondence Grant had believed was destroyed. Claire had recovered them after reconciling with her father. The district attorney's representative, seated near the aisle, began taking notes before Martin finished speaking. Naomi followed with the tenant files, payment records, internal emails, and sworn testimony from the inspector, who had accepted immunity in exchange for cooperation. Curtis Bell had done the same. Grant's face changed when he heard that. Not dramatically. Not like in movies where villains suddenly confess. Just a tiny collapse around the eyes. The moment he realized the men he paid to protect him had chosen themselves instead, his attorneys whispered urgently, One closed the presentation laptop. Another removed the lakefront row model from the table as if the little glass towers had become embarrassing. The council voted unanimously to deny the redevelopment permit, preserve Harbor View under the land trust, and refer the entire record for criminal investigation. People behind me began crying before the chair finished reading the decision. Mrs. Delgado grabbed my shoulders. Mr. Boone lifted his cane and shouted something that would never be approved for television. Maya wrapped both arms around my waist, and my father, who did not fully understand what we had won, smiled because everyone else was smiling. Grant stood alone beside his lawyers. His coat was still perfect. His shoes still shined, but the room no longer moved around him. As he passed me, he stopped and said quietly, "You think this makes you powerful?" I looked at him and said, "No. It proves I never needed to be powerful alone." 4 months later, Grant Wexler was indicted on charges involving bribery, fraud, tenant intimidation, and conspiracy. His company entered receivership. Several former properties reopened their housing complaints, and investigators found the same strategy repeated across 3 states. Curtis testified. The inspector lost his license. Grant's lawyers insisted he had merely pursued aggressive redevelopment within a complicated regulatory environment. Maybe a jury would believe that. Maybe wealth would still soften the landing. Justice is not always as clean as people want it to be. Harbor View survived. The repairs took months, and the elevator still groaned like it resented every trip. But the heat worked. The roof stopped leaking, and no orange notices appeared on our doors. The land trust converted the building into permanently affordable housing governed by a resident board. Mrs. Delgado became president because she was the only person stubborn enough to read every page of the bylaws. Mr. L. Boone became safety coordinator, a title he used mainly as permission to complain professionally. Naomi asked me to join the board. Then Claire offered me a job with the Vale Family Housing Initiative, helping tenants document harassment before it reached the point of eviction. I said no twice. I told her I was a cleaner, a waitress, and a woman who barely remembered to pay her phone bill on time. Claire said, "Exactly. We have enough people who understand buildings as investments. We need someone who understands what it means when a building is home." I took the job. Maya's scholarship remained intact, and by spring she was arguing with teachers in debate club, using words I occasionally had to look up. My father's dementia continued, because kindness can change a life, but it cannot negotiate with every disease. Some mornings he knew me. Some mornings he called me by my mother's name. The difference was that I could finally afford reliable care and spend time with him as his daughter, instead of always being his exhausted nurse. Martin's treatment slowed the cancer but did not erase it. Claire moved back to Milwaukee with her husband and son. The grandson Martin had never met. Every Sunday, they ate together. Sometimes they argued, because forgiveness is not magic and 6 lost years did not disappear after one phone call. But they stayed at the table. That was what mattered. Nearly a year after the night we met, Martin and I returned to the same bus shelter. The plastic roof was still cracked. The bench had fresh paint, and someone had replaced the broken light above it. He sat beside me with his cane between his knees and asked whether I would still hand my phone to a stranger at 11 at night. I told him honestly that I did not know. A week after our story appeared in the news, 3 people tried to borrow my phone at bus stops, and one of them definitely wanted to steal it. Martin laughed until he started coughing. When the coughing stopped, he looked down at his hands and said, "People will turn what you did into a lesson about generosity. They will say kindness always comes back. I hope you do not believe that." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Most kindness is never rewarded. Sometimes the person you help will disappoint you. Sometimes nobody will notice. Sometimes you will hand over the phone and receive nothing except a wet sleeve and a late bus. It still matters." I thought about that after he left, because he was right. What happened to me was extraordinary, almost impossible. But the value of that night could not depend on Martin being rich. If he had been exactly what he appeared to be, a sick, homeless stranger with no company, no lawyers, and no land trust, the call would still have mattered. He would still have heard his daughter say she loved him. Maybe that should have been enough. So let me ask you the question I still cannot answer easily. If a stranger approached you late at night, soaked by the rain, shaking, desperate to make one call, would you hand over your phone, or would protecting yourself come first? And when a wealthy developer promises jobs and tax money, but those promises require pushing poor families out of their homes, Where does progress end and theft begin? Tell me what you believe in the comments. Because I think reasonable people can disagree about caution, property rights, and how far one person should go to defend a community. But silence is the one answer men like Grant Wexler are always counting on. Share this story with someone who has ever felt invisible. And subscribe if you believe ordinary people deserve stories where they are not rescued because they were secretly important, but because they were important all along.